Hello, everyone. It's Jeff Rich here from the Burning Archive. And have you been curious about or watched some of Professor Jiang's videos on predictive history? He has been quite a sensation over the last year or so, and I have noticed at least, has started to appear reasonably frequently on various geopolitical YouTube channels. Often not so much commenting about history as just general political commentary. And I wanted to make a video today, assessing the quality of Professor Jiang's work, perhaps indicating how you can best satisfy your curiosity about getting the big picture of world history that Professor Jiang offers in his Predictive History YouTube videos. My overall assessment is you ought to beware. His lectures are not all they claim to be. They're very wide-ranging, and you've got to applaud his qualities as a communicator, but I really think that the old lesson is that history never predicts, and that Professor Zhang's history is, well, let's have a look at some better models of learning from history. That's what I'm going to talk about in this video. So Professor Jiang is a Chinese professor who is like a deputy principal or something like that. And he really burst onto the scene a year or so ago. Incredibly successful, partly because he appeared to have correctly predicted Donald Trump's election and also the attack on Iran by Israel and the United States in mid-2025. Now, predicting Donald Trump's election last time round is perhaps not such a miraculous achievement, a bit of a coin toss, really. And predicting Israel and America might attack Iran is also perhaps a bit of a coin toss as well. But nonetheless, he has been spectacularly successful in recent times. He's produced lectures and talks really about a very large sweep of world history. And it is, I guess, an interesting and entertaining way to get introduced to those topics. But as I said, he started to appear regularly on geopolitical news shows and present himself as not just professor from a Chinese school commenting on history, but as a guru on geopolitics. And one needs to perhaps ask whether he really is such a person. I've watched his videos and tried to make sense of them myself based on the premise that his interest in history is great. He's serving you in giving a accessible version of history and satisfying your interest in the sort of big questions of how it all hangs together. But I think there are certain things, and I'll sort of highlight them in a moment, that are not really serving your genuine curiosity about understanding history better. And of course, Professor Jiang is not the only person who does this. There are a lot of bogus ideas about history out there on YouTube. On my channel, The Burning Archive, I really do try to look at world events from the perspective of genuinely quality world history. And I'll talk about that a little bit more on the video. So it is a little bit frustrating, I've got to admit, at times when one sees material which is not really all that high quality getting the attention that it has done in the case of predictive history. Unfortunately, Professor Jiang, in my estimation, as both a PhD in history as well as an ex-government official, where, I've got to tell you, in government, you have to listen to a lot of cranks and a lot of pretenders, and you hear a lot of experts who end up not being all that expert. I don't think Professor Jiang is worth your time. There are much, much better ways to learn from history, and I'm going to point you to a few of those in this video. So don't be sucked in. History never predicts. And at the end of this video, I will share with you a much better way that you can satisfy your curiosity or fresh ideas about the big picture of world history. So let's first have a look at Professor Jiang. Now, there are so many lectures that he's provided. I cannot say I've comprehensively looked at his entire output. And I want to recognize first up that there is something incredibly appealing about his manner, his communication style. In some ways, he's not dissimilar to the Jordan Peterson phenomenon of a few years ago, who sort of popularized certain ideas about psychology and culture in a way that was accessible and particularly appealing to certain demographics and interests. And I think in some ways, Professor Jiang is doing something similar for a certain angle on history. But unfortunately, I actually think a lot of what he says is mashed up sort of theories popular in the sort of Silicon Valley world and not very credible theories as well. Given the range of topics he's talked about and the eccentric construction of a lot of his evidence and arguments in some of those lectures, and I'll come to that in a minute, I do wonder if there's been a little bit of AI assistance in his enormous output. I also tried to have a look at his Substack, which has a very large number of subscribers, but the Substack is entirely paywalled except for the first one or two sentences of the article, so there's no way really to appraise the nature of his written arguments on history. My Substack has much more material unpaywalled, so if you really want to read some quality history, head over to jeffrich.substack.com. Not to Predictive History. I just want to mention a couple of the big appearances that he's done recently. One was with Glenn Deason, where, to be honest, I found a lot of the theories put forward by Professor Jiang were really just recycled sort of commentary from geopolitics channels. There was nothing substantive from historical research in them whatsoever. And similarly with some of his appearances with Danny Haipong and similar channels. I wanted to mention a couple of specific videos that he has provided that I have had a closer look at. One was on social collapse, which was a very mixed up reliance on the ideas of Peter Turchin, which I've done a video on, and you can have a listen to that in the link to that is in the video description. And you got a very bastardized version of that in his conversation with Glenn Deason. He claimed there were 3 theories of civilizational decline. Really, only 3 theories of civilizational decline. One is, Peter Turchin's elite overproduction. One, weirdly, he claimed was Thomas Piketty's argument in Capital, which is really not about civilizational decline. And the other one was the very dated and rather strangely misunderstood Oswald Spengler from about 1918. Hardly a convincing presentation of the range of ideas on social decay and collapse or political institutions. So really, the sort of ideas he puts in his sort of collapse videos are really not credible at all. He also did a video on modernism, which I found truly, frankly, wacky and not at all convincing, claiming modernism's to blame for everything to do with modern culture. There's an enormous literature on modernism. Almost none of it is evident in any of his discussion of this matter. And I've also written quite a bit on modernism myself, including, Virginia Woolf's famous essay about how in 1910 human character change and the sensibility of modernism. And you can read that in my Europe World Tour over at jeffrich.substack.com. But the one I really particularly wanted to focus on was his video on bureaucracy, because I, after all, was a bureaucrat for 33 years. I've got a pretty strong evidence base from my lived experience, my historical research, my sort of broader intellectual investigation of how bureaucracy is understood and commented on. And I wrote a book, 13 Ways of Looking at a Bureaucrat, which also examined these issues. And frankly, Professor Jiang's Predictive Histories video on bureaucracy is truly bizarre. He uses sources to make his various claims for bureaucracy, including that bureaucracy is inherently totalitarian. He uses Kafka, the famous essay about the famous novel, The Trial, where K is arrested for an unknown crime. He, which of course is partly about legal procedure and the state, and not just about bureaucracy. He uses the very anarchistic American libertarian sort of thinker James C. Scott, thinking like a state, and distorts his thinking as well. Not that his thinking is all that credible, and he puts a truly bizarre misrepresentation of Hannah Arendt's The Origins of Totalitarianism to say that all bureaucracy and government institutions tend towards totalitarianism, fundamentally misunderstanding the work, betraying a sense that, maybe some AI bot sort of generated these 3 interesting titles about bureaucracy and sort of put it all together for him. But I really don't know. It was a truly atrocious piece of work. And after I watched that, I decided that really Professor Jiang was not worth me spending any more time. And that's why I'm making this video, to share that assessment with you. More broadly, I would also say that a lot of his commentary on history is sort of mashed up, misunderstood and unreliable sources. A lot of things that are very popular in the alt history world. Writers like Carol Quigley, the American, who wrote a quite bizarre, almost conspiratorial book that many people are quite fond of from the 1960s, and a very half-grasped version of Oswald Spengler. And he makes a lot of use of Peter Turchin's work, which has its own weaknesses, which I've discussed in previous videos. And indeed in discussions with Jamal Thomas at the Jamal Thomas Morning Show. You can see some common thought patterns in Professor Jiang's presentation of ideas. Let me mention 5 common ones that are particularly suggestive of perhaps both where his thinking comes from and also why it has been so appealing. He likes to present a grand, unified conspiracy where he weaves together disparate events, ideas, and figures into a single interconnected narrative driven by a secret, malevolent elite. Always a popular theory video on YouTube. For example, the Protestant Reformation's crisis in faith is linked to Freud's psychological theories, which are then popularized by the CIA as modernism to combat communism by promoting a cult of the self, which in turn leads to the modern epidemic of depression via social media. This is almost, insane in its logical connections, let alone the absence of any real historical chain of evidence for any of those propositions. This pattern reduces the complexity of history to a monolithic plot, attributing all major developments to the intentional actions of a single group. The second big theme in his work is the secret knowledge appeal. He often frames his narratives as a revelation of a hidden truth, again making them popular. His whole theory is premised on the idea that a bit of game theory and a bit of Peter Turchin and a bit of, something else he found on the internet. He has secretly decoded the underlying workings of history and can predict what is coming next. And he often positions himself in this sense as an insider, sharing forbidden history, using phrases like what you learn is actually the real history of humanity. The secret was international finance. There's a real strong element of Manichaeanism or dualism and good versus evil, where the world is presented as a stark struggle between two opposing forces. On the one side, forces of community love, truth, and humanity, with his personal heroes. On the other side are the forces of the elite, control, deception, and slavery. This is the kind of theory that is appealing to Peter Thiel and co., with a little bit of Bowdlerized Rene Girard and his theories about sacrifice. The fourth pattern in his thinking is a real argument from analogy as proof. He relies heavily on very cartoonish historical analogies to explain the present and predict the future. For example, his equation of the American empire with Athens during the Peloponnesian War, where NATO is the Delian League and America's pressure on its allies is identical to Athens stealing from its tributaries. This historical comparison is utterly absurd and trivial and unhelpful, as I have discussed in my history videos on NATO, and I'll include a link to them in the video description. And then finally, there is a real thesis about transgression as power. A recurring theme is the idea that the ultimate source of power and group cohesion lies in breaking social taboos. And this is the secret, the core secret of the elites who rule the world. It's highly speculative, unfalsifiable claim, but it's the linchpin of his particular theories of secret power. So, no doubt there are perhaps some good sides to Professor Jiang, but he's getting a pretty good run at the moment. He's been given, I think, undue credibility by some geopolitics commentators. And really, I just don't think his lectures are worth you wasting your time on. So, and that is especially so because there is so much better history out there available. So one really should not have to put up with sort of AI slop and, American tech bro nonsense. There is a lot of bad commentary and on geopolitics based on bad history and a lot of bad alt history and pseudo history on YouTube right now, and a lot of repetition of old, misunderstood or popular theories, civilizational decline, and all this sort of crap. And one of the things I've been doing on my YouTube channel for the last couple of years is trying to fight against some of this nonsense by sharing with you some really genuine quality history from the best world historians out there. I've done interviews with many of them, such as my recent interviews with Michael Carley about the conduct of World War II. I've interviewed the great world historian Felipe Fernandez Armesto and many others. And I think these interviews give you a much deeper insight into the nature of history than any of the nonsense you'll listen to in Professor Jiang's videos. I've also done book reviews and guides to some of the best histories out there, like John Darwin's Rise and Fall of after Tamerlan, the Rise and Fall of Global Empires, like Peter Frankopan's The Transformation of the World, like Marie Favereau's The Horde, How the Mongols Changed the World, and I also interviewed Marie as well. So there is a lot of quality history out there, and I'm not the only person doing this. So look for better sources than Professor Jiang. Ask yourself the question, how does he really know this? What are his sources really based on? How much history has he really done? His qualifications weren't in history, and it's not his core expertise. And finally, the other great thing you can do is check out some of my history book recommendations on Substack. All this year, I've been doing a world history tour of world powers, looking at the 5 great civilization states of the world: United States, China, India, Europe, and Russia. And using that as a way to get a much bigger, broader perspective on the way history really works and what really happened in those areas beyond the kind of cliches and stereotypes and over abstract theories of someone like Peter Turchin or indeed like Professor Jiang. One of the things I've always found about history is it's the unique stories, it's the unique individuals, it's the unique kind of events. And, very simplified analogies are not actually all that helpful for understanding. Isaiah Berlin, the great political philosopher, once said that the real reason history helps with political judgment is because political judgment involves understanding what is the particular issue in this particular set of circumstances with these particular people and individuals and conflicts of interest and all the rest of it. It's not some abstract sort of theory about elite overproduction or civilizational collapse that really helps you understand a situation. It's the ability to pay attention to the individual eccentricities, the characters, the unique combination of circumstances, the conflicting range of causes in any circumstance that you really need to do. And that is the real benefit of history. So the third big point I really wanted to make in this video is that there is something really practical and enjoyable and a shared experience you can do to satisfy your curiosity about the big picture in world history, to find some really quality new ideas about history, not just putting up with boring mainstream narratives, but actually finding out what the best historians are really thinking about some of these big stories today. And that's why I've set up what I'm calling the world's best history book club on my Substack at jeffrich.substack.com. Next year, the world's best history book club is going to introduce you to 10 of the best history books, one per month over 2026, and also introduce you to some classics to help give you some deeper understanding of, how the best historians of the 20th century and the 21st century have really thought about framing big narratives about world history, because amateurs, dare I say it, like Professor Jiang, make a lot of rookie mistakes in the way in which they do it. In this book club, you can join me as we read over 10 months, 10 of the world's best prize-winning histories published since 2020. So this is not old crap like Oswald Spengler. This is the best history being produced today, winners of things like the Wolfson History Prize and the Kundal History Prize. All subscribers at jeffrich.substack.com will get my personally curated list of these top recently published books and my reflections on some of the issues they raise in my weekly posts, my historical insights on Saturday. Paid subscribers will get more. They'll get a monthly reading guide to the book, an introduction to each book, and an opportunity to chat and comment on the book with other readers. Of course, if you become what I call an Angel of History, the top tier membership, you also get to be on a live call discussion with me about the book each month. Of course, you don't have to read them all, but I'm confident that if you will find at least one book on this list to add to your personal must-read list for 2026, give yourself a couple of weeks to go through one of these books rather than wasting hours and hours and hours on YouTube watching Professor Jiang's nonsense. And what's more, All 10 of these books are on my personal must-read list. I'm just not going to sort of dump them on you saying you really must read this because I read it a couple of years ago. These are books that I've been wanting to read for a while because I know they've been award winners, because they have some really interesting ideas, because they relate to some fundamental topics of really present day interest, including, for example, what's going on in the Americas right now. So being part of the World History Book Club will be a joint experience of mutual learning and discovery about what the best in world history can teach us all today to deal with how the world is changing, to make sense of it, to put some better narrative and analytical frameworks around it than a lot of the YouTube slop that is out there in the geopolitics and history channel world. I've chosen the books to reflect a fair but not a perfect spread of geography, and there are some common themes that I'll be writing about in my Substack, and I'll have more to say about that in a video shortly. But let me just give you a bit of a sneak peek at the first book, which we'll be reading together in February 2026, and that is Greg Grandin's America, A New History of the New World. America as in the sort of Spanish, I guess, version, the language version of America. It reframes the history of the Western Hemisphere as one braided story rather than separate USA and Latin American narratives. It begins with the Spanish conquest and the destruction of the pre-Columbian societies, or at least mutilation of those societies, and then traces independence movements, competing empires, and the rise of the United States as an expansionist power, an expansion that has almost never stopped. Grandin argues that Latin American thinkers and diplomats were crucial in developing ideas of sovereignty, anti-conquest, and international law, often credited to Washington and Europe. With talk of US military deployments on off the coast of Venezuela, with illegal, immoral assassinations of poor men and women in boats, allegedly running drugs off those coasts, with significant tension over Trump's a corollary to the Monroe Doctrine 200 years, more than 200 years since its original declaration. This book will be a timely and insightful read. Given that, why don't you put aside Professor Jiang for now, put aside a lot of the rubbish history that you read out there, ask yourself some intelligent questions about how do they really know that, and seek out the best world history books that are out there. I'm offering you a guided way to sort of get a shortcut to those best quality histories and to have a bit of intellectual companionship in making sense of them and applying the lessons of them. And the lessons are never simple to the contemporary world. So why not head over to jeffrich.substack.com, join up there, join me as a free subscriber, join me as a paid subscriber, join me as an angel of history so that you can be a participant in live call discussions of the world's best history book club. And if you do those things too, in a couple of weeks, you'll also get my list of 100 books to change your worldview, all of which were featured on jeffrich.substack.com. Make sure you share and like this video if you like, and check out my upcoming series on reviewing how those 5 big world powers, the 5 great civilization states of the world, have gone in 2025. How has the balance of power in the world changed in 2025? How has the search for ongoing American greatness gone? Or have Russia, China, India, and even perhaps Europe rebalanced the world? Thanks for watching.